Right, so my aim in this paper is to look at the daimonic imagination in the works of the modern Guyanese author Wilson Harris. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the role of what Harris calls strangers in the self, both in his writing practice and in his literary texts. So just before I get stuck into that discussion, I thought I'd give a very brief introduction to Harris and his work, particularly for those that aren't familiar with this author at all. So Harris's first novel, Palace of the Peacock, was published in 1960. He's a really prolific writer, and since then he's published a further 24 novels, with the most recent being The Ghost of Memory, which was published in 2006. And he's written 2 books of poetry, a critical study, and countless essays during that time. In the post-colonial field, he's most widely known as a thinker and a writer of the cross-cultural or the cross-cultural imagination. And his investment in cross-culturalism should be understood, at least in part, as originating in the complex culture and the cultural histories of Guyana itself, a country whose population is predominantly made up of peoples of African, Indian, Amerindian, European and Chinese descent. And he himself has mixed African, Scottish and Amerindian, specifically Arawakan heritage. So there are arguably 2 defining features of Harris's cross-culturalism. The first, obviously enough, is the effort to bridge gaps between different cultures. The second is an effort to engage in or to represent imaginative traditions in the Caribbean and Guyanas and beyond that are habitually figured in terms of loss, erasure or obsolescence. So this latter aim in his work needs to be understood in the context of the histories of colonisation in Guyana and the Caribbean more generally. In cultural terms, if not others as well, the impact of colonialism in the Caribbean is customarily thought of as being particularly severe. Native Amerindian populations in this region suffered extreme implosion during colonialism to the point of extinction in many of the islands, though not in Guyana. Primarily as a result of the introduction of European diseases. Immigrant populations, African peoples who had brought to Guyana through the slave trade and the Middle Passage, as well as Indian and Chinese peoples who came to the country as indentured labourers, suffered traumatic deracination and deculturation. So in addition to the catastrophic human impact of colonisation, these drastic and traumatic cultural changes, in conjunction with the colonisers' active efforts towards cultural hegemony, precipitated severe cultural breakdown and the loss, decimation and, in cases, erasure of the native cultural traditions of indigenous and immigrant populations alike. So around the time of independence then, many Caribbean intellectuals became preoccupied by what was thought of by some as the historylessness or the lack of history in the Caribbean. Writers who are interested in developing national or regional literatures, which isn't something that Harris was particularly interested in, struggled with the seeming absence of cultural memory, past and traditions in which to ground their counter-colonial imagination. Harris, however, is part of a group of writers, which includes, for example, Derek Walcott and Edward Glisson, who rejected the whole idea of historylessness. It is, as Walcott says, absurd to claim that people has no history, and located the problems instead in European concepts and practices of historiography. And this, for me, is one of the areas where the daimonic imagination comes in for Harris. So to restate my argument in this context a little bit, the main thread of my argument here is that the daimonic imagination, in the form of working with strangers in the self, is thought of by Harris as fundamental to the cross-cultural imaginary. Or to put it in slightly different terms, these strangers in the self are, for Harris, the principal mediums of the cross-cultural imagination. In contexts in which gaps between cultures seem unbridgeable, or where conventional forms of memory and historical knowledge are incapable of mediating between peoples of the past and the present, these daimonic guides become the mediums of connections between the author or reader and imaginative traditions that are assumed to be beyond the reach of knowledge or memory. So in terms of his critical writing then, Harris's thinking about working with strangers in the self is developed primarily in a series of essays and talks from the 1980s and 1990s. And I want to start by discussing a few examples of the ways in which Harris has conceptualised this process. So in a 1990 lecture called Originality and Tradition, Harris explains his experience of discovering connections in earlier works that he had not been aware of at the time of writing in the following way. You may think it a bit astonishing that one should say one has discovered something in work one has written, because you would assume that I would know about it when I wrote it. But the fact is that I find that it is as if, when one writes, one is writing in concert with strangers within oneself. The whole revisionary strategy comes out of the way these strangers in the self work together so that there are clues, intuitive clues, one plants in the narrative that seem alien. The temptation arises to cut out these intuitive clues, but I find myself revising through these clues and a certain kind of strategy emerges. I concentrate very deeply on the process of revision, but the fact is that there are certain connections that seem to exist in the narrative which I am not conscious of even as I write it. Sometimes it takes some time to see the text working in such a way that one is able to sense these connections as if a stranger has planted them there. It's as if the text is alive in its own right, and the text has this capacity to revise itself. The text has an intention of its own because its resources are alive, new and old, ancient and modern, a complex revisionary psyche within the body and bodilessness of language. And in another essay from the same period called The Validation of Fiction, A Personal View of Imaginative Truth, Harris gives a very similar account of this revisionary strategy, describing once again a writing process in which he revises through intuitive clues that appear to have been planted in his narratives by another hand, as if, he says, a demon navigates within the imagery of the text. So the revisionary strategy that Harris describes here is almost the exact opposite of more conventional ideas of revision. Rather than striving towards correction or consistency, Harris is working with the instabilities of language, the fact that any use of language can produce meanings or associations that are beyond the author's intention, in order to actively unhinge or unsettle his own conscious imaginative productions. The purpose of this, Harris suggests, is to disrupt conventional forms of memory and cognition in such a way as to enable the author to enter into dialogue with unconscious, eclipsed or marginalised imaginative resources. So he talks, for example, about this process enabling the language of the buried imagination, subconscious and unconscious strata of memory and live fossil myths in the soil of tradition, of which the author knows nothing, to erupt into consciousness. He talks about the emergence of buried voices through language, and this in a cultural context in which the English language in which Harris writes has eclipsed the languages of native and immigrant peoples in Guyana. And he also talks about the breaking of realist or visible texts of reality in order to reveal multiple other texts that are secreted elsewhere. Harris's dialogue with strangers in the South, then, is a kind of counter-cognition, and he argues that it's a process that calls for immense concentration because, as he puts it, one is running against the grain of one's time. Something that I find particularly interesting in this essay is Harris's consideration of the implications of his working method for the way in which we think about what he calls the validation of fiction, or in other words, the way in which we seek to establish the truth or significance of an imaginative work. Harris begins by suggesting that imaginative fiction may be proven or validated, which is itself, particularly in a modern writer, in some ways an unusual assertion. What is more unusual still, though, is that Harris suggests that the imaginative writer should seek validating premises for their work, so the proof of their work, in imaginative traditions that are outside of the author's own immediate cultural context and knowledge, and of which he may know nothing at all. And he gives examples of this from his own work, of moments where he's discovered, in research or reading, myths from other cultures that provide him with a way of understanding or validating motifs within his own work. Now, my interest here is not really in corroborating these experiences of prescience and proof. I'm more interested in what it means to locate the possibility of, or premises for, establishing the significance, meaning and truth of an imaginative work outside of the author and their immediate context of writing, within an absent and unknown cultural other, or cultural interpretive milieu, whether past, present or future. We're all familiar with ideas of relativism, the notion that the same text can be validly interpreted from any number of perspectives and that the author themselves has no monopoly in this sense over the significance of the text. However, what Harris is doing here is quite different. He's suggesting that the imaginative writer's task is to visualise, record, substantiate and allow perceptions of the real that make no immediate sense to him. The writer therefore is working in a way that is grounded in exploration of faith. He's working to record that which appears, insofar as it does appear at all, irrelevant or meaningless, with the faith or hope that these insights will later be validated by imaginations of which he has no direct knowledge. Now this, I would think, does indeed call for immense concentration and of a quite extraordinary kind. So much of our attention and perception is, as we know, conditioned by cultural frameworks of significance, so that what we consciously perceive or notice even, what makes it through the subliminal filtering process, is what we know how to make sense of or can fit into some or other pre-existing cognitive template. So the process that Harris describes must involve, I'd imagine, a tremendous struggle against the routine functions of consciousness. There's one thing in particular I want to draw out of this, which concerns ideas about the relationship between the truth value of literature and constructs of identity, whether personal or collective. On the other, I think I was meant to say on the one hand at some point in there, and I didn't. A fairly traditional way of thinking about the validity of representation is in terms of its ability to be true to a particular experience. Now, the phrase "to be true to" has connotations of loyalty as much as veracity, and I think that is this idea that literary representation should be about being loyal to a particular immediate interpretive framework or interpretation, whether within the individual or in the wider community, that Harris is rejecting here. For Harris, immediacy is never unmediated, or in other words, our most instant impressions of things are actually, for Harris, often most strongly governed by dominant cultural epistemologies. What Harris is doing here then is suggesting that instead that literature should become less a medium of representation, a faithful representation of the same that is valued in accordance with how much is true to the experience of the author and their immediate community, and more one of communication, a labour through which one translates one's experience and perceptions towards the other, towards the anticipation of an absent other or stranger imaginative community. The way in which Harris works with strangeness in the self, then, is directed towards reconceiving the subject and the real in a way that is cross-cultural and other-oriented to the core. It effectively makes the writer's understanding of their being, and indeed the reality they inhabit, absolutely and fundamentally dependent or conditional upon the intelligence of the absent or unknown other or the stranger. So the last example I want to give from Harris's critical writing comes from a 1988 interview with the post-colonial critic Stephen Slemon, in which Harris approaches these same issues of writing process and revisionary strategy in slightly different terms, and in a way that further foregrounds the fact that there's a pretty unusual cognitive praxis at play in his creative method. In this interview, Harris explains his writing process in terms of a relation between what he calls the present body and the absent body. The absent body, Harris says, is rooted in an understanding of presence which lies beyond logical presence. It, the absent body, understands something that the present body fails to understand, and yet the present body may be visited by the absent body and vice versa. And he calls this kind of encounter a cross-cultural visitation. As Harris explains it in this interview, the absent body is brought into play through a relationship between the author and the real that I tend to think about in terms of a belonging without. So where the dual implication of this term can suggest a form of belonging that allows for a kind of distance or relinquishing that is not mediated through an effort to conquer, capture or claim. So the example that Harris gives is of a moment in which the author or the subject most generally seeks to seize the object, the vessel, he says, out there. Whether in imaginative or physical terms, the act of seizing depends on a relation to the object as a simple, graspable entity. Harris describes this particular form of subject-object relations in which the object remains graspable, as it were, as a kind of obsessional code or obsessional space, which binds us into relations of one-sided command and greed. But that obsessional space can be fissured, Harris suggests, when, in his words, the thing out there that a culture seeks to seize, addresses us in a totally different way, or when the object of our obsession acquires new distances within itself that may alter certain prepossessions by which the imagination is encrusted. So when these obsessions are fissured, Harris says, it's obviously painful, but they may release a mood that I call distance. And in that distance, the sensible body is extended, and intermissions to do with the absent and present body may then run closely together. This condition of withinness and withoutness may then become reasonably true. It can never be wholly true. And when that happens, one has to sense that there are genuine forces at work, which I would call intuitive forces. So Harris's absent body and his strangeness in the self then are basically variations of the same thing. They are both, as it were, figures or mediums of an imaginative agency that occupies the negative space of the author's own conscious intelligence. Uncells, anticells, or other channels of the imagination, they are substantiated and activated as the author works to distance or estrange himself from the frames of identity and immediacy in which his agency would usually operate. All in all, then, the creative process that Harris describes, working with strangeness in the self or working through the absent body, is quite strikingly unusual. It is in some senses comparable to forms of automatic writing. There are also strong connections to some varieties of negative theology and Christian mysticism, such as practiced by St. John of the Cross, for example, particularly in his emphasis on the process of voiding or negating a possessive kind of belonging to the world in order to come into communion with the numinous other. And at the same time, while the philosophy and motivations that drive this process are very different, there are some distinct comparisons with postmodernist literary practices in the sort of use of language, the textual revisions and deconstructions that Harris describes. So I want now to play some of these ideas out through one scene from Harris's novel, which is the scene I've given you in your handout. His first novel, Palace of the Peacock, which is one of the scenes that has most fascinated and perplexed his readers across the decades. So to frame it very briefly, Palace, I'll call it that for shorthand, is the story of a Guyanese crew's journey into the interior, into the inland rainforest of Guyana. What's strikingly different about this tale of a voyage into the heartland is that the crew are already dead. Their epitaphs are inscribed, as the narrator tells us, in a place called Sorrow Hill. They are then, as the narrator says, reliving an earlier innocent voyage, and ultimately in the course of the narrative they also relive their own deaths. So the narrative journey in this sense comprises a strange kind of fictional afterlife, in which the fiction of their life that is written in this novel is coexistent with the fact of their death, which is written and inscribed on Sorrow Hill. So the scene I'm focusing on comes early in the novel when the crew reach an impassable block in the river, and they have to carry the boat through the bush, and then remake their connection to the river on the other side. So this is the scene, and I'll just read it so it's the same thing as you've got. The crew, all of us to a man, toiled with the vessel to lift it from still water and whirlpool. At last it stood on the flat stone. We placed round logs of wood beneath it, and half rolled, half pushed, until its bow poked the bushy fringe on the bank. This was a signal for reconnoitre, a wild, visionary prospect. The sun glowed upon a mass of vegetation that swarmed in crevices of rocky nature until the stone yielded and turned a green, spongy carpet, out of which emerged enormous trunks and trees from the hidden dark earth beneath and beyond the sun. The solid wall of trees was filled with ancient blocks of shadow and with gleaming hinges of light. Wind rustled the leafy curtains, through which masts of living beard dangled as low as the water and the sun. My living eye was stunned by inversions of the brilliancy and the gloom of the forest in a deception and hollow and socket. We had armed ourselves with prospecting knives and were clearing a line as near to the river as we could. The voice of roaring water declined a little. We were skirting a high outcrop of rock that forced us into the bush. A sigh swept out of the gloom of the trees, unlike any human sound, as a mask is unlike flesh and blood. The unearthly, half-gentle, half-shuddering whisper ran along the tips of graven leaves. Nothing appeared to stir. And then the whole forest quivered and sighed and shook with violent, instantaneous relief in a throaty clamour of waters as we approached the river again. We had finished our connection and we began retracing our steps in the line to the starting point where our boat had stopped. I stopped for an instant, overwhelmed by a renewed force of consciousness of the hot spirit and moving spell in the tropical undergrowth. Spider's web dangled in the shaft of the sun, clothing my arms with subtle threads as I brushed upon it. The whispering trees spun their leaves to a sudden fall, wherein the ground seemed to grow lighter in my mind and move to meet them in the air. The carpet on which I stood had an uncertain place within splintered and timeless roots. Its fibre was stone in the tremulous ground. I lowered my head a little, blind almost, and began forcing a new path into the trees away from the river's opening inside. A brittle moss and carpet appeared underfoot. A dry pond and stream, whose course and reflection and image had been stamped forever like the breathless outline of a dreaming skeleton in the earth. The trees rose around me with upward flying limbs when I screwed my eyes to stare from underneath above. At last I lifted my head into a normal position. The heavy undergrowth had lightened. The forest rustled and rippled with a sigh and a ubiquitous step. I stopped dead where I was, frightened for no reason whatever. The step near me stopped and stood still. I stared around me wildly in surprise and terror, and my body grew faint and trembling as a woman's or a child's. I gave a loud ambushed cry which was no more than an echo of myself, a breaking, grotesque voice, man and boy, age and youth speaking together. I recovered myself from my dead faint, supported by old Schomburg on the one hand, and Carol, the young Negro boy, on the other. I was speechless and ashamed that they had to come searching for me and have found me in such a state. So I think what I'm going to be focusing on here is the fact that when you read this scene, I think it's what a lot of readers find, you get quite fascinated by what it is, in fact, that's kind of, that scared the reader so much that he collapsed into a dead faint. And that's kind of been what's preoccupied people when they're reading this for a while. So that's what I'm hoping to kind of look into a little bit. So in some ways, as I hope you might be able to see, this scene functions on one level as an allegory of the visionary process itself, so the process I was describing in which the author revises something that is familiar to them. Within the circular framework of a narrative that relives an already once lived journey, the narrator in this episode begins retracing his steps over a line that he and his crew have plotted through the bush just moments before. And furthermore, after the narrator's collapse and after this scene that I've read, when he finds himself speechless and incapable of explaining the source of his fear and disorientation, the narrator casts his and the reader's eyes back over his tracks quizzically, yet another time, leaving us with a lingering impression of something already seen and yet somehow missed. So bearing in mind the experience of unbelonging and estrangement that I've been foregrounding as central to Harris's revisionary strategy, and invoking both Freud and Homi Bhabha here, the post-colonial theorist, I would say there's something decidedly uncanny or unhomely about these uncertain returns over well-trodden ground, troubled as they are by the anticipated re-emergence of something hidden or forgotten within the field of familiarity, so return of the repressed in sort of more familiar terms. And with an eye to the subtitle of this conference, Uncanny Intelligence, I'm wondering whether something of the relationship between the daimonic and the uncanny might be understood in terms of the kind of unhoming of experience that Harris engages in here. So as we retrace our steps through this passage, we find that part of the unsettling impact of the scene registers in a disturbance of a particular concept of home, one that is associated to the colonial vision of the land, and which is symbolised in this text by the house that Donne, the conquistador figure of the novel, had elaborately constructed in the savannas from which to rule the earth. So the narrator, so this is from this passage again, describes ancient blocks of shadow and gleaming hinges of light that appear within the solid wall of trees, suggesting an entrance into complex dimensional space. The homely image of a carpet that he envisages at his feet a number of times actually disintegrates alarmingly, revealing itself to rest upon an uncertain place within splintered and timeless roots whose fibrous stone in the tremulous ground. A mass of living beard appeared through leafy curtains like faces at a window, inviting his departure from an edifice of domestication and signalling an encounter with the unfamiliar animated life of the forest. Now, concepts of home play a crucial role in this novel. The journey of the narrative might generally be understood as a journey from the house of colonial history, which is connected to the house that Donne, this conquistador figure in the novel, has set up, and the name Donne is also a play on Donne as in finished, complete, and therefore it's connected to history. So a journey between that space and the archetypal cross-cultural space with its many possibly endless rivers of the universe, which is Palace of the Peacock at the end. And that is multiply associated to El Dorado, the earthly paradise on Mount Roraima, with its great food-bearing tree that marks the beginning of many Amerindian cosmogonies in Amazonia, including the Soto Caraguatuna and Pemon mist cycles, and the stage in the alchemical opus that is called the Corda Pavonis, or Colours of the Peacock. At the same time, echoing the metaphors of the John Donne poem, Hymn to God, My God in My Sickness, which is a crucial intertext for this novel, the narrator of Palace of the Peacock repeatedly draws analogies between the body and the map, between his anatomy and prevailing colonial topographies of Amazonia. Thus, at the beginning of the journey, he reflects, the map of the savannas was a dream. The names Brazil and Guyana were colonial conventions I had known from childhood. They are as close to me as my ribs, the rivers and the flatland, the mountains and the heartland I intimately saw. And yet, despite recognising their fictionality and mythical provenance, the narrator still admits, I could not help cherishing my symbolic map and my bodily prejudice like a well-known room and a house of superstition within which I dwelt. So part of what is happening in this scene through its stranger readings of a familiar place is the kind of dislocation of the subject that I described earlier, their dislocation from an immediate frame of presence, the present body as well, and being in the world, and their resituation within an absent or buried cross-cultural imaginative community. So returning to the scene of this scene again, one of the questions that repeatedly troubles readers of this text is, what is it exactly that triggers the narrator's collapse? So the outline of the dried-up waterway that stops him in his tracks, the dry pond and stream that he describes as a dreaming skeleton in the earth, is a tracery of the past within the present. It's an inscription of natural history that recalls the perpetual activity and movement within the forest landscape that he traverses. And its skeletal profile intersects and intercepts the line of the living river that forms the backbone of the crew's narrative and journey, and which, in a way that once again resonates with Donne's poetic vision, is symbolically charged with overtones of a river of life or time, a passageway between life or death. So approaching it from another angle, we might say that this dreaming skeleton in the earth that he sees is like a buried path of memory or another storyline that's crossing with his own, that he has previously overlooked within his own experiential narrative. So again, I'm kind of returning to that idea of like following a stranger path through memory. And as the narrator momentarily inhabits this buried spatial imaginary, screwing his eyes to stare from underneath above, as he says in that passage, he has started to see the trees rise around him into upward flying limbs. Now that image is an incredible image of death, resurrection and remembrance, and I'm using that in a hyphenated sense, the term of putting together limb to limb. He sees these upward flying limbs. This flight of a fluvial skeleton upon risen and rejoined arboreal limbs. And as this anatomy of movement within the forest confronts the narrator's own, the two come into curious relation. Whilst the life and activity of the forest is remembered, The narrator experiences the dismemberment and dislocation of his own agency. His body seems to him like a woman's or a child's, and in the ambushed cry that resounds as a mere echo of himself, the sound of his self displaced, he hears a breaking and grotesque voice, fractured into the split and several intonations of man and boy, age and youth, speaking together. No longer simply a background to the progressions of his continuous identity through space and time, then, in this scene, the living landscape fishers the narrator's being along the lineaments of its own motion. And as the outline of the dreamy skeleton in the earth looms large, with its intimations of an environmental history and the articulation of environmental imagination, buried imagination as well, the narrator's own body and anatomy grows faint, like a fading text, paling into palimpsest or background. It is almost as if the narrator stops listening to the sound of his own lifelines and in this moment becomes open to the other textualities that he instinctively suppresses. So this reading introduces another dimension to the unhoming of experience in this scene. In this image of the resurrected dreaming skeleton in the earth and in the narrator's description of what he calls the ambushing forest and wood, we glimpse an image of the bush spirit that is common to many Amerindian cosmogonies in this area. Now, in Freud's theory of the uncanny, the connection between this apparition and the unhomely atmosphere of the scene would make sense in a particular way. Freud gives two possible causes of the uncanny. One is the return of repressed childhood complexes, and the other is the return of what he calls primitive, animistic modes of thought that have been supplanted and yet seem once more to be confirmed. And he uses that word supplanted deliberately instead of repressed in a gesture towards the willful construction of a highly Eurocentric progressive teleology. So what takes place in this scene, however, is very different. The apparition of the bush spirit is imaginatively validated and substantiated in a way that works internally to unfound distinctions between the primitive and the modern, and allows in this way for the return of an Amerindian spatial imaginary into the scene. Thus, in the resurrected dreaming skeleton of the earth, we might also see the reanimation of the native corpse of tradition and memory. I might stop there because I think that's not a bad place to stop.